Top of the morning to you and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Security Council urges Russia to stop the Hunger Games. Resume grain deal as it ends. UN Security Council speakers condemn Russia's termination of the Black Sea Grain Initiative as U.S. accuses Russia of weaponizing food. Plus, Russia launches strikes on Odessa 24 hours after Kerch bridge attack. Thank you for joining us. Russia has indeed withdrawn from the Black Sea Grain Agreement. Following this, the United Nations representatives have called on the Russian government to allow export of Ukraine's grain. The deal expired yesterday, after Russia quit and warned it could not guarantee the safety of ships, in a move the United Nations said will strike a blow to people in need everywhere. Foreign ministers from Poland, Germany, and Ukraine were amongst those gathered in the Security Council, urging the continuation of the deal. Moscow suggested that if demands to improve exports of its own grain and fertilizer were met, it will consider resurrecting the Black Sea Agreement. However, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that a UN pact that aimed to help facilitate Russia's shipments over the past year was also terminated.
Agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security in Ukraine. Thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Dmytro Kuleba, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security...
His Excellency Mr. Siato for his...
Thank you, Mr. President. Russia has been adding fuel to the fire of a global food crisis. As a result, families on every continent...
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union.
Now, the United States will continue to work with other countries to ensure the movement of grain out of Ukraine after Russia halted participation on Monday in the year-old UN-brokered deal that allows its neighbor to export grain through the Black Sea. This is its commitment, according to the White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby. The United States is not considering using U.S. military assets to help protect grain shipments.
We urge the government of Russia to immediately reverse its decision. Meanwhile, the United States has and we will continue to work with other countries to enable both Russian and Ukrainian grain to reach the rest of the world, including by ensuring that our sanctions do not target, contrary to Russian propaganda, they do not target Russian food or fertilizer, and we will continue to support Ukraine's efforts to get that grain to markets that desperately need it, even if that's through other routes. A lot of work to be done here. This is a deeply regrettable and, as I said, a dangerous decision that we urge Mr. Putin to reverse.
Russians to stop it. And then on the bridge, which...
Basically, you're arguing that, you're arguing, but you're suggesting that we should just try to run a blockade, an effective military blockade in the Black Sea, because that's what's happening here. No, that's not an option that's being actively pursued.
None of that being discussed by Turkey had...
You should take that in two bites. Number one, I've seen nothing that proves causation here, that the strike on the bridge led to Putin's decision not to extend. He had already been leaning that way publicly. Now, I won't speak for him. If he has his own justification, he can do that. But I've seen nothing that points to causation. And then to your second question, we don't take it upon ourselves to determine legitimacy or illegitimacy of targets that the Ukrainians hit. They're fighting for their own country. Crimea is Ukraine. And we don't tell them, what is or what isn't legally a legitimate target. They determine their targets for themselves.
So it's not at all in the same category as strikes inside Russia, which is something...
Strikes inside Russia, we made it clear to the Ukrainians that we won't encourage and we won't enable strikes inside Russia. What we are trying to do, and have been for 16 months, is making sure that they can defend their own territory and to push back the Russian aggression on Ukrainian soil. Crimea is Ukrainian soil. That's Russian propaganda. Our sanctions aren't targeting Russian agriculture. They were still, even as the grain deal was in place, able to get their grain and foodstuffs out, and there's no sanctions on fertilizer. This isn't about shutting down Russian farms. That is a trope that Putin puts out there, so there's no reason to consider changes since we're not doing it in the first place.
Way in the back there.
Thank you.
No. We don't know where all these guys are. We think some of them may still be in Russian-occupied territory in Ukraine. We know some have gone to Belarus. We've seen reports that some have gone to Africa. I mean, there's still a viable group here, and they're still doing some pretty bad things. But whether or not what happened with Mr. Prigozhin has had a dramatic impact on the war in Ukraine, I would have to say it's too soon to know right now. And the short answer is, in terms of the counteroffensive, we haven't really seen a major impact.
Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has called Russia's decision to halt participation in the Black Sea grain deal unconscionable and called for the pact to be restored as quickly as possible. Mr. Blinken added that the U.S. will be looking for alternative ways of helping get Ukrainian food on the world market, but added that options such as rail and road will not allow for the same volume of export as the Black Sea deal did.
The Black Sea Initiative enabled the safe export of some 33 million metric tons of foodstuffs from 3 Ukrainian ports, including more than 750,000 metric tons of wheat transported by WFP, helping to relieve hunger in Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, and Yemen. The initiative helped bring down global food prices. The Memorandum of Understanding on Russian food and fertilizer exports also delivered concrete results over the past year. As the Secretary General stated this morning.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says he has written to the Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres calling for the continued operation of the Black Sea grain shipment deal. In his nightly video address, he added that Russia had no right to determine who had enough food to eat, and that the grain initiative will operate with or without Moscow's participation. Explosions were heard in the city of Odessa in the southern Ukraine early today, about 24 hours after an apparent Ukrainian attack on the Kerch bridge that connects the annexed Crimean Peninsula with mainland Russia. Witnesses on the ground heard air raid sirens at about 2 a.m. local time and saw air defenses operating across the city, followed by 4 large explosions. Subsequently, they had 4 additional explosions and a string of anti-aircraft fire in the port vicinity. Serhiy Bratchuk, a spokesperson for the Odessa military administration, said the Ukrainian defense was repelling a Russian air attack.
What makes you believe that Kerch Bridge is a civilian infrastructure, given that it is mainly used to supply Russian army in the occupied Crimea and in the south of Ukraine with ammunition, fuel, and other military equipment necessary for the Russian army to continue its war of aggression against Ukraine? Not every bridge is civilian by definition. And this particular bridge, first, it was built illegally. It exists beyond the law, and we should always remember that. And second, it is mainly used for military purposes, and we should consider it as such.
A Russian Su-25 fighter bomber has crashed into the Sea of Azov near the town of Yevsk, but the pilot ejected, according to local officials in a statement on social media. Unverified videos shared on social media appear to show a parachute descending over the sea near a beach and a large splash in the water. Yevsk lies across the Sea of Azov from the Russian-controlled part of Ukraine's Donetsk region. Officials from Russia's Krasnodar region say the pilot had been rescued from the water. Now let's talk to Senior Fellow, Forum of Transregional Studies, and Senior Researcher, National Academy of Science, Professor Victoria Sarita. Professor Sarida is joining us virtually from Berlin in Germany. Professor Diakuyu, thank you, and Dobro Horanko, good morning for joining us on the program today.
Proszę, dobro Horanko, good morning.
Tak. Now, the Black Sea Grain Initiative has expired. In the art of negotiation, you give a little to get a little. You may have to concede something to get something more, but you keep the negotiation going so that at the end of the day, your desires are more or less met in situations such as this. Knowing that the Black Sea deal was going to expire Istanbul time midnight yesterday till today, Russia says that the Ukrainians attacked the Crimean bridge, and some senior officials say that seemed to have angered the Russians in the midst of this Black Sea grain deal, trying to extend it. Do you think that the United Nations, the United States, and maybe Turkey and Ukraine handled this negotiation properly to get a better outcome?
They are working in given circumstances, and if you follow news for the several months before, you will see that Russia constantly threatened to stop this deal, and actually there were several points when this deal was on paper but was not really working. So this is not the first time when Russia really threats the world with the hunger just to push its own agenda. And I think so far negotiations are not really successful, but I do hope that upon the return of the Turkish president, he's right now is in an international visit, maybe we'll be getting more news because he has certain more leverages to push, to pursue Russia to continue this grain deal. Another possibility could be that, of course, US already declared that they are not going to use their vessels to convoy the shipments. But maybe we could have United Nations military support in this case, who would be guarding different countries, would be guarding these vessels and helping them to pass Black Sea to continue grain deal, because Ukraine immediately expressed the interest in continuing and responsibility for continue this grain deal.
One of the favorite words, well, one of the most familiar words becoming more familiar by the day in the United States is weaponization. In the US itself, the Republican Party accuses some quarters of the weaponization of the FBI, weaponization of the DOJ. The Secretary of State says that Russia is weaponizing food to afflict the world so as to have one up over Ukraine. But does Russia have a point when it says that its own food and fertilizer exports are suffering from a secondary sanction of trucks and means of transportation, which is why they say their own objectives are not being met, so they see no reason to continue the deal? Does Russia have a point in that aspect?
I guess all these issues and points were negotiated during the first round and the second round of negotiations toward the grain deal, and then Russia agreed to that grain deal, and this was a really big breakthrough. However, Ukrainian officials already at that moment were warning the international community that this is quite typical for Russia to make a deal or to agree to a certain point and then to withdraw and try to use it as a leverage for gaining more possibilities, more rights, or its own agenda. And I don't think this is really fair or moral to use the food, which is so much needed outside, everywhere globally, as a leverage of gaining certain political moments. And what Russia also did tonight because Ukraine announced that we will try as much as possible to ship this grain different ways, not only via Black Sea, but also maybe through using other corridors. They attacked Ukrainian south ports immediately this night. There was a huge attack which was covered by Ukrainian military, but if they were not successful, then they were trying to destroy the infrastructure which would be working for the grain deal.
That's my point. My point also in bringing up the attack on the Crimean, the bridge to Crimea, is that was it the best time for that kind of incident to happen, knowing that you wanted Russia to be of a mind to extend the deal, and then you attack one of its sore points the day before, the very day you want the deal to be extended, you go ahead and you attack the Crimean bridge. What did you think Russia was going to do?
But this bridge was also attacked last year. So, and as many Ukrainian officials explained, that right now Ukraine has an attempt of counteroffensive, and for Ukraine this means a lot when this supplies, the bridge is used for military supplies mostly. And if Ukraine can interrupt this supplies for at least certain period of time, this really helps Ukraine to gain its territories, including Crimea, because Crimea is Ukrainian territory.
Professor, what is your assessment of the current state of the counteroffensive? The Deputy Defense Minister of Ukraine, I believe, Hanna Maliya, says that the fighting is coming thick and fast, that they are shifting in positions on both sides, that the Russians have mounted their own form of counteroffensive. They gained some incentive. The Ukrainians pushed them back. What's your estimation of how things are going?
I'm not military expert, but what we see, the counteroffensive is going slowly and slowly is moving. But of course, Ukraine is very careful, first of all, because Ukraine cares about lives of soldiers. And Ukrainian losses are not as high as were losses of Russia during their offensive periods. And also Ukraine is waiting for the military supply from allies to be able to, especially right now, there are discussions about training Ukrainian pilots for F-16 jets. So gradually they're gaining certain spaces, but it's going very slow. And one of the reasons to attack Crimean bridge was to interrupt military supply for the southern parts of Crimea and southern Ukrainian parts, which are under occupation.
Professor, the children are being taken, Ukrainian children that is, into Russian territory. The Vatican Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, I believe, in the United States for a 3-day visit of some sort, having been to Ukraine and to Russia, and the Vatican now seems to have boxed themselves into this, or they have redirected their intervention in this matter to humanitarian concerns and not mediation. It's hard not to criticize Russia because Russia says that they are taking the children for their own protection. They're not kidnapping them, they're not abducting them, they're taking them for their protection because of the war that is going on in those areas. But the argument then that I say is, if you're taking them for their protection, why don't you return them to Ukraine? Why are you taking them into Russia? What's your view of how the incident is being handled concerning the children who are Ukrainian who've been taken into Russia?
This is an extremely painful issue for Ukraine and for Ukrainian parents, because in many cases, parents do not even know where their children are. And the way how Russia protects those children is actually against the international law. And this were one of the reasons why Putin was announced as a military criminal. And the problem is that first of all, parents don't know, but if anybody, any party can help or interfere, or at least get some information about the children, it's extremely valuable because, as I said, to fight for the children, you need to know where they are, what is happening to them, to whom to apply, which documents to supply. And in many cases, parents do not have these possibilities.
Finally,
We don't know about thousands of kids, where is their location, with which families they are staying, or not, maybe not families.
It's very hard to take. It's very, very, very tragic, this affair concerning the children. Now, finally, Professor, tell us what your feelings are at the moment. The Ukrainian spirit doesn't seem to be dampened by the continued onslaught of the Russians and the occupation of those certain territories, and the performance of your president, Vladimir Zelensky. What's your impression of the Ukrainian spirit in this difficult time?
What we observe from sociological surveys, that the spirit stays quite strong, that we do not have any radical or even visible drop downs in support of Zelensky, and especially in support of military operation which will deoccupy territories of Ukraine. And actually all major surveys are showing that absolute majority from all parts of the Ukraine believe that Ukraine should really deoccupy all territories, and only this should be the point for the peace. So Ukrainians are not ready to give up their territories.
Thank you so much, Professor, for making out the time to talk to us this morning. I will attempt to say see you later in Ukrainian, do zустрічі.
Do zустрічі. I'm surprised. Have a nice day.
You too. When we return, U.S. aid chief announces over $500 million in aid in visit to Ukraine. Details in a moment. Please stay with us.
From the north to the south, east and west, Network Africa brings you news stories from all around the continent. With wide range in coverage, insights and analysis of special issues, we dissect Africa in its beauty and peculiarities. Network Africa tells the African story from the African perspective. Network Africa, weekdays at 4 p.m.
Just Nigeria cares about the things you care about.
I'm young, I'm a Muslim, I'm Hausa.
With many more perspectives.
I'm a health systems consultant,
project manager,
IT expert.
Whether visiting tech startups, education hubs,
or on the ground,
get informed opinions, trusted analysis.
Cash is an anti-cashless policy.
And most importantly, get to the gist of the news that matters most to you.
Just Nigeria, from the BBC and Channels Television, every Wednesday at 9 p.m. and online too.
Welcome to the sophomore stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. The United Nations inspected the last cargo ship to leave Ukraine under the UN-brokered Black Sea grain deal on Monday. The UN said in a statement that the Turkish-flagged Samsun TQ had been cleared to proceed after its inspection off the coast of Istanbul. Moscow's decision to end the Black Sea grain deal has caused fears in poorer countries that price rises will put food out of reach. Russian President Vladimir Putin is demanding concrete proposals on ensuring the security of the bridge linking southern Russia to Crimea after an attack overnight that he called a terrorist act that had caused serious damage. President Putin was speaking in a televised meeting with officials to assess the consequences of the attack. Meanwhile, President Putin also threatened that his defense ministry is preparing proposals for a response to the overnight attack that damaged the road bridge linking Crimea to southern Russia, for which he blames Ukraine. At the end of the televised meeting with national and regional officials to assess the consequences of the attack, President Putin called it a cruel and senseless act, and he said the bridge had not been used for months to supply Russian forces fighting in Ukraine. Ukraine did not officially claim responsibility, but Ukrainian media said Ukrainian security services had deployed maritime drones. Russian Deputy Prime Minister Marat Kushnulin is giving his country the assurance that the road bridge linking southern Russia to Crimea will be completely repaired by November the 1st, after the overnight attack that caused severe damage. Speaking in a televised meeting with Russia's President Vladimir Putin, he said there was no damage to pylons, that one section of the road had been completely destroyed and will have to be rebuilt. He added that road traffic will resume in one direction by September the 15th, with road traffic in both directions restored by November the 1st. The parallel railway bridge was not damaged in the attack. The U.S. aid chief, Samantha Powers, has announced more than $500 million in humanitarian assistance for Ukraine during a visit to the war-torn country. U.S. Agency for International Development Administration, POWER, in a visit to the State Emergency Services headquarters in Kiev, announced the assistance to respond to the needs of Ukrainians affected by Russia's invasion. POWER toured equipment provided to Ukraine State Emergency Services by Washington and met Ukraine's famous mine-sniffing dog called Patron during her visit.
But today, I also would like to announce that the United States will provide more than $500 million in additional humanitarian assistance to our humanitarian partners to scale up their response on the front lines. I want to start by expressing grave dismay with the Russian Federation's decision to withdraw from the Black Sea Grain Initiative. This is a reckless decision that will have profound human consequences. And it's just another example of Russian callousness and disregard for human lives and livelihoods, not only here in Ukraine, but all around the world.
Now we're joined virtually from Akoka in Lagos, Southwest Nigeria, by Head of Department History and Strategic Studies, University of Lagos, Professor David Awarawo. Good morning, sir. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Thank you for making out the time to be with us. A harsh response or critique will be that who was the genius on the Ukrainian side that decided to bomb the bridge leading to Crimea, knowing that the Russians at this point could be looking for any excuse to not prolong the Black Sea grain deal. What are your thoughts?
Well, you know, this war is becoming more and more nasty, and it's just unfortunate the way things are shaping up. The destruction, people have said, is strategic to prevent Russia from getting, supplies, cutting off supplies, well, in one way or the other. And, there's also the other side to it that would give Russia the excuse to expand its attacks and launch more vicious, destruction in key areas in Ukraine. But it's not surprising. That is how the wars, when they expand, when they drag like this one has, these are the kind of things that one sees. Everything is put into it to try to win it. And we just hope that this escalation does not further expand, such that things that people didn't envision would be used in this war will eventually be resorted to try to win it.
Does it hold merit what Russia is giving as an excuse that their objectives are not being met and secondary sanctions on their food export and fertilizer exports were not considered in the initiative, therefore their withdrawal?
Yes, first the agreement on grain exports that was agreed to and renewed several times. There were concerns that at some point, if Russia feels that it is not making progress, it might, decide to back out and not minding what the consequences will be to, the global system, the global economy, and that is now stretching to several other things. Russia, of course, the sanctions are biting harder now, and Russia is responding by attempting to disregard whatever discussions have been, carried out in the past couple of weeks. And so Russia is staying further and further away from the rest, and the little consensus and concessions that Russia has been granting to enable things to still go normally until now, Russia seems to be backing out from this, and that again is not good for Russia, it's not good for Ukraine, it's not good for the global system.
What would be good for the rescue of these children who are in Russia, and not of their own volition, but on the excuse of the Russians that they are being held for their own protection? And as we saw, Professor Sarida, the Ukrainian professor who we just spoke to, saying that these children, the parents don't know where their children are, the children don't know where their parents are, and that this attempt by the Vatican to try and broker some sort of negotiation will hopefully yield results. Do you see them making any headway in the issue of the return of the children?
Yeah, I think they'll make headway. I'm particularly happy about that. That is one of the few, things that I'm positive about. I'm saying this because Russia itself has claimed that the children are not captured, they are not in captivity, that the children are just been taken for safety, that, these children were exposed to violence, and they decided to take them to keep them safe. Since that is the claim of Russia, I countered this in my last interview by saying that if that indeed was the case, there were measures that Russia could have taken instead of taking the children away. I mean, there are many international organizations that are working in Ukraine that could easily have, taken custody of these children after Russia, took them. That taking them to Russia, I mean, there's elements of this indoctrination, the attempts to, just take them away. But the intervention of the Vatican and some other interested bodies, I think, would enable Russia to release them, because Russia will not have any further excuse, to keep them. If there is the negotiation ahead and it is established that the arrangements have been made to take them back to Ukraine safely, and so the protection that Russia is giving will no longer be necessary and required. At that point, even if Russia does not like it, it will not have any other excuse, not to release them. So I'm confident that that will yield fruit.
Thank you for that insight, Professor. Let's ask you now, I don't believe we've spoken about the recent release of the cluster munitions from the United States to Ukraine. What's your position, given the fact that now President Putin says that they have cluster munitions of their own and they have a sufficient stockpile, and the way he said it seems to mean he has more than enough, that this will degenerate into a cluster munition war at the front line? Whose purposes will it serve the most?
I'm a bit surprised that the United States decided to approve the supply of those cluster munitions to Ukraine. given the fact that all the while, the United States has said that it is trying to just assist Ukraine to protect itself. I'm not sure that cluster munitions will fit into that narrative. I'm a bit surprised, really. And what all of this will lead to will be escalation. Whether Russia has its own cluster munitions or not, when these weapons are supplied to Ukraine and they begin to use them, Russia will look for some other deadly weapons too to use to attack Ukraine. And the consequence put together will be escalation, extreme escalation of the conflict. I will be surprised. I will have thought that the US will supply some other weapons that will enable Ukraine to actually protect itself and not cluster munitions. So this approval by the US and then the comment by Russia that it has cluster munition of its own is very, very concerning.
Does that then give credence to schools of thought that the US is not doing enough in the worst case scenario to help to bring this war to an end, and is in some cases, in the best case scenario, and in the worst case scenario, it's actually even maybe instigating this war, making it a true proxy war between itself and Russia?
That is the point I just made. That I was really surprised because a few weeks ago when the British Foreign Secretary spoke and said, well, Russia could when there was this attack inside Russia, and Ukraine was accused of carrying out some of these attacks. The Americans were more measured in their response. They didn't openly support it. They only said they would wish that Ukraine would be able to defend itself against Russian aggression. The British Foreign Secretary was, was more open by saying that, well, Ukraine could do that because, I mean, if that's part of what Ukraine needs to do to be able to triumph in the war. So given the position of the United States, measured, not presenting itself as a country that is out for a war against Russia, a proxy war against Russia, I'm surprised that there's been this recourse to cluster munitions. I would have, expected more, expanded supply of weapons for Ukraine to defend itself, as the United States has claimed, and not cluster munitions. So it is difficult to really explain why the US has decided to resort to it, because from the Russian side, Russia would respond, in equal measure. And the consequence will be escalation, death, and destruction, especially in Ukraine.
Indeed, we have to keep in mind that these cluster munitions have this explosive yield that is delayed and fails in many cases, leading to explosions many, many years after they have been located, wherever they have dropped in their various locations. But now to the non-conditional defense of Ukraine and total withdrawal of Russian forces, which the Ukrainian presidency and the Ukrainian regime has taken on this Russian occupation of Ukraine, is predicated on the supply of their weapons from their allies, from the European Union. The British official who said that President Zelensky should be more grateful, and the other who said that they're not Amazon, they can't be asked for weapons as though you could just go to a supermarket, get an Uzi, go to a department store, get a Kalashnikov, get a missile, get a Scud missile, and what have you. It's not as easy as it seems. That the British government is doing their best. Do you think Ukraine is looking in the right direction, consistently arming itself? Does it have a choice?
Well, yes, where Ukraine is now, anywhere you can get help from, Ukraine will seek it. The rhetoric that would be necessary for Ukraine to get world leaders to support its cause, Zelensky is doing just that. So that is expected on the part of Ukraine. But the position that Russia will withdraw all its forces including areas occupied in 2014 before any negotiations will take place, that will not work. That's an extreme position that Zelensky is taking. For this war to come to an end, for negotiations to take place to bring the war to an end, Zelensky will need to shift ground, Ukraine will shift ground, Russia will shift ground. And a major area where Ukraine will need to shift ground is this insistence that all Russian forces must leave Ukraine, and all the occupied places, even those occupied in 2014 in Crimea, Russia must pull out from all of it before negotiations will commence. That will not work. Those are areas that Ukraine will need to shift ground. Of course, Russia will need to shift ground in some areas for genuine negotiations that will bring this war to an end to take place. So Ukraine will seek help from everywhere and anywhere it can get it, but it will not make it win the war. So that's why, moving forward, what Zelensky must have in mind is that he needs to shift ground, and insisting on the total pullout of Russia from Ukraine before they begin negotiations will be asking for too much. That is an area where we need to shift ground. Of course, Russia too will also need to shift ground. There have to be concessions here and there from both sides before they begin to now negotiate effectively to bring the war to an end.
Thank you so much, Professor. That's similar to the sentiment of Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, although nobody from Ukraine's side wants to hear it from him, that negotiations should begin, and he offered to broker that, to start that in another degree, and saying something about November coming to, and that it should not be conditional on whether the Russian troops totally withdraw. Thank you so much for your contribution and your thoughts this morning. Professor David Aworawo, University of Lagos, Head of Department, History and Strategic Studies, for being with us today. Many thanks.
Thanks you very much, and have a nice day ahead.
You too. After the break, Crimea holds funeral for foreign, that is... Welcome back to the final stretch of our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Pope Francis has sent a high-level emissary to speak with U.S. President Joe Biden about Moscow's deportation of Ukrainian children, according to a report by news agencies. It added that, according to that report, Cardinal Matteo Zuppi is expected to meet President Biden at the White House today. Cardinal Zuppi's three-day visit is aimed at exchanging ideas and views on the current tragic situation and supporting humanitarian initiative, the Vatican statement disclosed. The humanitarian initiatives are intended to alleviate the suffering of the most affected and vulnerable people, especially children. Russia claims it evacuated children from the conflict zone for their own safety. Now we turn our attention to the world of business and how it's affected by the Ukrainian conflict and vice versa. Our channel's television business correspondent, Ini John Mecca, is with me in the studio. Ini, good morning.
Good morning.
Privyt.
I was expecting
You're
that.
You're going to end up speaking Ukrainian.
You're going to have to teach me. Once you teach me.
I'm learning.
Well, when you learn, then you teach me.
If I can get past the 5 or 6 words that I know. Okay. The Black Sea Grain Initiative has ended. This is the day that foreboding many did not want to see coming.
Yes.
Especially neutrals, and especially the countries that are getting the short end of the stick.
Yeah.
Ini, why did this happen this way?
Well, obviously because you guys have refused to meet up with what Russia has been asking for.
We guys.
You guys. All right, so Russia, of course, have been asking, you know, that you include their agricultural bank back to SWIFT so they're able to carry out transactions.
Yes.
They've been asking for logistics and insurance from companies without the threat of sanction that will be involved in transporting their food and fertilizer, you know, from their country.
What will be the immediate impact of this?
Oh, Well, the impact started yesterday, Olumide.
Right.
Already we've seen the price of wheat. It's up there from yesterday. It had a little bit of reprieve because some people are hoping, and I think some people were hoping that by tonight or last night, you know what happened with the last one, perhaps there'll be a change of heart, and then we'll wake up this morning and see that, oh, there've been maybe a concession between both parties or all parties involved. But unfortunately, that has not happened. So even this morning, the price of wheat has also increased. It's up 0.3%. It's now $6.56 a bushel. And we expect it to go up higher, you know, and to trickle down to countries like Nigeria, like the Asian countries that are depending on grain from both Ukraine and Russia. Because fine, we have Ukraine without the alternative using the other European countries. But as we have discussed many times, those corridors are very minimal. They do not have the capacity to transport or export as much as the world needs from Ukraine. You know, so at the end of the day, there's less supply, there's shortage in supply. Then things like wheat, like noodles, and you love bread, so get ready. Already before now in Nigeria, bread makers had already hinted that there was going to be a 15% increase in the price of bread. So with this now, the shortage of all those grains that are being used and increase in price is what we're looking at, unfortunately.
Russia is seizing assets in Moscow, obviously assets of foreign companies. They talked about seizing the yogurt of makers of French origin, and also Carlsberg, the beer.
Exactly.
They said the language they used was temporary administration.
Remember when we talked about Unilever giving the excuse that they did not want to leave Russia because they do not want Russia to take over their company? Well, this is part of it, because Russia had enacted a law, an act, you know, I think it was last year, that when all those multinationals, especially those from the Western world, and they say, oh, we're not operating in Russia anymore because they don't want to be involved in funding the war through taxes and other revenue, then Russia had their law, and then they said they were going to take over. So this is just part of it. They've taken over these two companies now, and I mean, it's their law in their land, so what would they do? I mean, they have their own excuses to say that...
What are the legal ramifications of this? Obviously, it wasn't the countries that fired the first shot they weren't the Russians. It was the allies of Ukraine.
No, but we have
across the board.
But the others haven't seized, even though that's still in the news, the issue of seizing their frozen assets and all of that.
The sanctions, they've seized oligarchs, they've seized luxury yachts, they've seized things of that nature.
And owned it? They haven't owned it.
Okay, so
it's frozen. Those assets are frozen. And that's why they keep talking about legal ways to use the proceeds, you know, from there to fund reconstruction of Ukraine.
That's the same thing. They're placing it by arbitrary
But they haven't done it yet.
Okay, so but that's how they're looking.
I haven't heard that they've done it. They've been frozen as, you know, forms of sanction. But we haven't heard that Russia's frozen assets have now been channeled, you know, for one thing or the other. But in Russia, it's been happening since last year. They've been taking those the companies and owned by Western companies, you know, they've seized them.
That was the arbitration being sought by by Ukrainian companies, oil companies in Crimea over the assets that have been taken over by Russia to get arbitration so that they can dispose of those assets in other countries.
Well, even as we speak, in Europe, you also have some assets from Russian Central Bank.
Okay.
You understand? That's also in the news.
Right.
And even in Europe, they are not able to agree. Because while the EU Commission is saying that, okay, they should continue operating, perhaps because they had a revenue of more than 7 million euros in the first quarter of this year. The bank, the ECB, you understand, the Commission Bank is for the region, is asking that, okay, there should be windfall, they should take the assets and channel it to us, and they have not even been able to agree, you know, to come to a common ground. So perhaps because bigger people are involved, you know what I mean, a larger number of countries and parties are involved, you know, so it's not easy for them to come together and agree with what to do with the frozen assets of Russia.
Right.
But Russia is one country. Of course, when Putin speaks and makes a law, then it's a law. You have to
Does it come under speculation where, because nobody knows when this war is going to end, what if it ends tomorrow and you've already bought some Russian assets? Where does that leave you? Or you've taken over some Russian assets and the owners come and say, okay, the war is over,
well,
give us our stuff back.
Well, I guess whoever gets involved with this kind of controversial property and company has to know at the back of their minds that, you know, this could happen and this could happen. We don't see the fine print, which I'm sure will capture some of this. It's a risk. If you want to get involved with Russian assets, or you want to get involved with Western assets that are in Moscow, you understand? There's a risk.
It's a huge risk.
A risk. And
you want a Russian billionaire breathing down your neck. Thank you, Ini.
Thank you,
Ini, say diakuyu.
Yakuyu?
Diakuyu.
Diakuyu.
You just said thank you in Ukrainian.
Oh, diakuyu, Olumide.
You're welcome.
Have a great day is what? You learn it tomorrow.
Have a great day. I could say bevita.
Vita.
Bevita is see you. Goodbye.
Oh, bevita, Olumide.
Bevita to you. You can join Ini John Mekwa on Business Morning after this program. Finally, a funeral ceremony has been held in Crimea for a Russian ex-submarine commander shot dead last week in the southern Russian city of Krasnodar. Mourners gathered in Sevastopol, Crimea, to pay their last respects. The individual was gunned down early on July the 10th in the southern Russian city of Krasnodar. His address, picture, and personal details had appeared on the Ukrainian website, a vast unofficial database of people considered to be enemies of Ukraine. On July the 11th, the word liquidated in red letters had been superimposed on his photograph on the site. Russia's State Investigative Committee said on July the 11th it had arrested a suspect in his early 60s who was found in possession of a pistol and a silencer. It published a short video showing heavily armed security officials storming a house and detaining the man who was wearing only boxer shorts, his underwear. According to reports, he was deputy head of military mobilization in the city and had previously commanded the Krasnodar submarine in the Black Sea. That's where we leave it for today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you to our viewers, our guests, and our producers for today's edition of the program. Please join us again tomorrow. Have a good day.